The late afternoon sun poured through the tall glass windows of the Sterling Grand Hotel, a place known not only for its golden chandeliers, imported marble floors, and the quiet hum of wealth that seemed to float in the air like perfume, but also for the kind of invisible walls it built between those who belonged and those who did not, at least according to the unspoken rules written in the smug expressions of its staff and the carefully curated clientele. It was here, in this glittering sanctuary of privilege, that an old black man named Samuel Carter stepped inside, his shoes scuffed with age but polished with care, his suit faded at the edges yet neatly pressed, his movements slow but dignified, and as he crossed the lobby he carried not only a worn leather wallet in his breast pocket but also the heavy history of battles fought long before any of the men and women lounging in that gilded space were even born, battles of survival, of prejudice, of dignity, of proving himself again and again in a world that too often dismissed men like him before ever listening to their story. Samuel was in his late 70s, his hair silver and close-cropped, his face carved with the deep lines of time and hardship, but his eyes, dark, steady, sharp, still carried the fire of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and lived not only to tell about it but to rise above it, and when he approached the front desk, leaning just slightly on the mahogany counter, he did so with the patience of a man who had endured years of being underestimated, overlooked, and laughed at, though today he had no idea he would once again be tested in that very same way. The receptionist was young, maybe in her early 20s, her hair styled sleek and sharp as though every strand was part of her professional armor, and she wore the Sterling Grand uniform, a fitted blazer, crisp blouse, and name tag that read, Samantha. With the kind of self-importance that comes not from true achievement but from proximity to power, for she had learned to measure her worth in the status of the guests she checked in, and when she first glanced up and saw Samuel standing there, his skin dark, his suit plain, his shoes without any recognizable designer emblem, she did not see a guest to be served but a man to be dismissed, an interruption in the glossy rhythm of her carefully curated day, and instead of offering him the practiced hospitality smile drilled into every staff member during training, she allowed her lips to curl upward into something else entirely, mockery. "Good evening," Samuel said gently, his voice calm, low, carrying a kind of old-world courtesy rarely found anymore. "I'd like to book a room, if you please," and though his words were polite and his tone respectful, Samantha could not resist the urge to laugh, not loud enough to cause a scandal yet sharp enough to sting, and she leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing, as she said with a giggle that carried more venom than mirth, "Sir, this is the Sterling Grand Hotel, are you sure you're in the right place?" Her laugh was not hers alone. Two businessmen sitting nearby in velvet chairs overheard her tone and smirked behind their hands, a couple waiting to check in glanced over with thinly veiled amusement, and the subtle but unmistakable ripple of derision began to spread across the lobby. Samuel stood there, unmoving, his expression calm, as if he had rehearsed this moment in 1,000 different forms across his lifetime, as if the laughter of strangers no longer pierced him but instead reminded him of every lesson life had taught him, that dignity cannot be granted by others, only guarded by oneself. Still, the sting was there, and behind his calm gaze flickered memories of younger years when laughter like this wasn't just embarrassing but dangerous, when a black man stepping into the wrong place at the wrong time could pay with more than just humiliation, and he wondered silently if the world had changed at all or merely put on fancier clothes while keeping the same heart. Samantha, sensing his silence as weakness, pressed further, saying, "Rooms here start at $700 a night, sir, and the presidential suite is booked years in advance for people of, well, very high standing," her eyes darting up and down his modest frame, the way his tie was a little frayed, the way his shoes creased at the edges, and though she smiled politely, her eyes betrayed her condescension, daring him to accept her unspoken judgment, that he did not belong. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that Samuel Carter was not merely an old man with a worn wallet, he was the architect of half the skyline they admired outside those tall glass windows, the owner of dozens of properties across the state, the founder of a charitable foundation that had sent hundreds of underprivileged students to college, a decorated war veteran who had bled for a country that often refused to see him as its equal, and, perhaps most relevant of all, the majority shareholder of the very corporation that owned the Sterling Grand Hotel chain, a detail he had chosen not to flaunt because power, real power, does not need to announce itself. Samuel had come quietly today not to be recognized but simply because he wanted to rest, to reflect, and tomorrow to host a private event in the very conference hall of this hotel, a gathering of veterans and community leaders, a reminder to the city that even in old age he was still building bridges where others built walls, but now, standing at that counter, he was confronted with yet another wall, one built from ignorance and arrogance rather than stone. "Perhaps you didn't hear me," Samuel said at last, his tone still calm but firmer now. "I'd like a room. Please check your availability." Samantha blinked, caught off guard by his persistence, and for a moment she faltered, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, but then she smirked again, leaned back in her chair, and said, "Sir, I really don't think this is the kind of place you're looking for. There's a motel 2 blocks down, much more affordable, and," she paused deliberately, "more your style." The words hung in the air like poison, and while a few guests looked away in discomfort, others pretended not to hear, unwilling to involve themselves in a confrontation that exposed the quiet prejudices many carried but never voiced. Samuel, however, did not flinch. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out the wallet worn from decades of use, and placed on the counter 2 objects that instantly shifted the atmosphere. A sleek black card that gleamed under the lobby's golden lights, the kind of card reserved for those whose net worth was measured in billions, and a gold identification card embossed with the Sterling Grand logo and the words, "Executive Owner." The color drained from Samantha's face as she stared at the items, her smirk collapsing into a stammer, her voice caught in her throat, and before she could piece together an apology, the double doors at the side of the lobby burst open and the hotel manager himself hurried out, alerted by the quiet murmur that had spread among the guests, his eyes widening as soon as they landed on the man before the counter. "Mr. Carter," the manager exclaimed, nearly tripping over his own polished shoes as he rushed forward, extending his hand with a respect that bordered on reverence. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow, sir. Please forgive us, please forgive any inconvenience. Your suite has been prepared, and of course the conference hall is ready for your event." The lobby, which had been filled only moments earlier with laughter and smugness, fell silent, the weight of realization settling over everyone like a heavy curtain, and the businessman who had smirked now shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the couple who had glanced over looked down at their shoes, and Samantha herself wished desperately that she could disappear, her cheeks burning as the truth revealed itself, that the man she had mocked, the man she had laughed at, was not only a guest worthy of her respect but the very owner of the empire she served. Samuel, for his part, did not bask in their shock, did not gloat or raise his voice. Instead, he picked up his cards slowly, placed them back into his wallet, and looked at Samantha with the kind of gaze that pierced deeper than anger ever could, a gaze heavy with disappointment, the kind that comes from a teacher who expected better of a student. "Young lady," he said softly, his voice steady enough to command the silence of the entire lobby, "never judge a man by what he looks like when he walks through the door. You don't know what battles he's fought, what burdens he carries, or who he truly is beneath the surface." Samantha's eyes welled with tears as she stammered, I'm so sorry, sir, I didn't mean," but Samuel raised a hand gently, stopping her words, and turned instead to the manager, adding, "Make sure she spends some time at our community shelters, working alongside the very people she thinks don't belong here. Perhaps then she'll learn what respect really means." The manager nodded furiously, promising to see it done, while the entire lobby sat frozen, guests whispering among themselves about the shocking revelation, their earlier laughter now transformed into awe. And as Samuel Carter was escorted toward the grand elevator that would carry him to the presidential suite he had quietly owned for decades, the whispers followed him, not of mockery now but of admiration, of respect, of the kind of reverence reserved for legends. And in that moment the old man who had once been laughed at left behind not just the sting of a lesson taught to a foolish receptionist but also a reminder etched into the marble halls of the Sterling Grand itself.